few weeks ago, Llano got in contact with me about testing out their laptop cooling pad. I ignored the first email as I thought the same thing most people think. These things are pretty much a waste of time and not really worth it. Then I saw a couple of reviews popping up online of this thing, and I just had to see it for myself. How good can a 100 to 120 pound laptop cooling pad with some bonus RGB actually be? Spoiler alert, it can make a massive difference. Llano have actually sent me some discount codes if you find this thing actually useful come the end of the video. You can find them in the description down below, right below that like button. Inside the box, you get a spare filter for the fan, a USB-C to USB-A cable, and the 36-watt power adapter. I thought that seemed a little bit much for a laptop cooling pad until you crank this thing up and turn on the RGB. I measured this thing drawing 31.5 watts of power at its highest speed and 9.1 watts at its lowest with the RGB turned on. Turning off the lighting reduces those numbers by about 7 watts. Also, you can't just turn on the RGB on its own, you need to have the fan spinning at the same time. But the most important thing inside the box is the Llano laptop cooling pad, and it's big. This thing can support laptops with up to a 19-inch display, and inside it packs a 140mm fan that spins up to 2800 RPM. Around the exterior is where you can see the RGB lighting. There are 4 modes you can cycle between, as well as 10 single color options you can choose. You can also get the cooler in white or without the RGB altogether to save a little bit of money. Personally, I do like the addition of the RGB lighting, though it's not very well diffused, so you can see the LED hotspots around the perimeter of the cooler, which is a bit of a bummer at this sort of price tag. On the side of the cooler, there are 3 USB-A ports, which you can make use of once connecting that USB-C to USB-A cable to your laptop. A handy addition if you want to leave your keyboard and mouse connected to the cooler if you plan on primarily using this thing at a fixed location. Honestly, I would have preferred if there were maybe some USB ports on the rear, or even the power cord was on the rear, as it would just make your desk look much cleaner. As a result, you will always see the cables for the power cord or USB devices just kind of sticking out of the side. Speaking of the rear, it's definitely giving some Alienware laptop kind of vibes. You can see exactly where Llano were going with their design here. Underneath, you can get access to the fan filter to make replacing or cleaning that much easier. And underneath, you can also see the adjustable feet too. The feet can be adjusted to 2 different positions to create a different angle for your laptop. Personally, I would always recommend setting it to the highest setting, so the fan at the bottom has more room to breathe and actually bring air in. You want to be placing this thing on top of a hard surface like a desk or table, not on top of your bed. I think that's something I do actually want to get across. If you are planning on buying one of these coolers, they're not the most comfortable thing for day-to-day use. You don't really have any wrist or arm support when typing or gaming over long periods of time. I'd say primarily you want to be looking at something like this if you mainly use your laptop connected to an external display and make use of a mouse and keyboard whilst docked. As for the rest of the cooler, there's not that much else to say. You've got some fold-up arms to help support your laptop, and the memory foam is removable if needed. If you're finding this video helpful so far, then feel free to click that like button down below and get yourself subscribed. It's massively appreciated. Now, turning this thing on is pretty straightforward. Plug in the power cable to the right hand side and then hold your finger over the power button for about 5 seconds. It's touch sensitive, nothing to click here. The 2 other buttons are purely for RGB control. The middle one with the M on it cycles between different modes, of which there is only 4. The rainbow wave effect, a solid color, a breathing solid color, or color cycling. The 3rd button is for choosing between individual colors for those 2 single color options. If you want to turn off the RGB, you can just hold the M key to disable it. Then the last thing to talk about is the dial for adjusting that fan speed. Overall, it works really nicely. You can increase the speed in increments of 100 RPM, which you can see on the display. If you slowly adjust the speed, it works flawlessly. But if you try to do it a little bit too quickly, it gets a little bit confused and it just flies up and down a bit randomly. So I guess the most important thing is how loud does this thing get? I'll give you guys a quick noise test so you can hear for yourself. And I'll give you a comparison of how loud my laptop's internal fans are in comparison too. So after that, you can hear this thing can get insanely loud. Though at the lowest speed at 300 RPM, it's probably about on par with how my laptop sounds when it's got the internal fans just blasting away. Even though my laptop has got a clever hinge that lifts the laptop up to allow more air in when you tilt the screen back, it still gets very toasty whilst gaming. Luckily, even though that hinge does create a bit of a gap, the memory foam is so squishy, the laptop just kind of sinks into it and creates a pretty good seal overall. So now it's time for the most important part, the graphs. so you can see for yourself at a couple different speeds what sort of impact this thing has on my Zephyrus G15. Obviously this will vary from laptop to laptop. You want a laptop that has some ventilation cutouts in the bottom so you can actually allow the air inside. Something like a MacBook probably won't be ideal for a cooler like this thing. First up, we'll have a look at the idle tests. Honestly, they're kind of pointless, as you're not just going to leave this fan blowing whilst your laptop is doing absolutely nothing, but I thought it was a fun test to see the difference anyway. Without the laptop cooler, the fans don't really spin, so the idle temps are pretty high. After 10 minutes of just idling, the laptop CPU temperatures averaged out at 62.5 degrees with a max of 72.9 degrees. Placing the laptop on top of the Llano cooler with it set to the lowest speed at 300 RPM, we can see it makes a big difference, dropping the average temperatures by nearly 20 degrees and the maximum by 22 degrees. It's obviously going to be a big difference because we've gone from idling with no fan to a 14cm fan blowing straight at it. Turning the speed up to 1500 RPM sees the laptop average temps drop by just over 5 degrees. Then cranking this thing up to the maximum's 2800 RPM shaved off only another degree. Now, for a more realistic benchmark, in Unigine's Superposition, the average temperature of the CPU was 84 degrees, with a maximum of 92.3 degrees. Sitting on the Llano cooler at 300 RPM reduced the average CPU temperature by 6 degrees and the maximum by 4 degrees. Increasing the speed up to 1500 RPM sees a massive decrease by 7 degrees in average and 12 degrees in our max temperature. Then turning it up to full speed only marginally reduced our CPU temps. The GPU sees a similar story, higher temperatures without the cooler, a good decrease at the lowest speed, a big decrease at 1500 RPM, and then a smaller impact at the highest speed. I also performed a CPU only test in Cinebench. Without the cooler, the laptop hits 95 degrees and just stayed there. Adding the Llano cooler back in can't save my Zephyrus G15 at 300 RPM. But at 1500 RPM, we do actually see those numbers start to come down. Then at 2800 RPM, it's only 2 degrees lower, but that's potentially worth it if you're doing an extremely long export. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about the maximum temperature. That's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. Then for the final test, I tested out a 15-minute match of Halo Infinite. Again, we see a similar story to that of Unigine Superposition. Extremely high CPU temperatures without the cooler, a nice decrease with it, then again a big decrease at 1500 RPM, and another decent amount at the full speed. The GPU temps are similar, but it's a more gradual decrease, and the temperatures of the GPU are generally a little bit more under control in the first place, with less spikes like we see on the CPU. Overall though, I'm really impressed with the numbers here. We're seeing drops of up to 16 degrees on the CPU, and just under 15 degrees on the GPU, depending on the scenarios. I feel like somewhere around the 1200 to 1500 RPM is probably that sweet spot for noise and temperature changes. Gaming laptops are used to running hot, so I feel like blasting this thing at its maximum speed is just too painful for the ears, and something I'd only recommend if you're just going to leave your laptop rendering or exporting a large file and you plan on leaving the room. At the lowest speed of 300 RPM, I think it's a fairly valid option, as we saw a decrease in temperature across all of the tests, excluding Cinebench that is, and it's not really much louder than the fans that are just built into my laptop. If anything, it's a little bit better and a little bit less high pitch. It would have been nice to have like a 200 or even 100 RPM mode as well, just enough to marginally cool down the laptop, but quietly enough that you can't even hear it. Much like how fans work on a desktop PC. Then when you're ready to crank up your workflow or start gaming, you can just slide that dial and let this thing fly. Now, is it worth it for £120 or about $130 in the US? Well, honestly, that's going to come down to your workflow and how much your laptop is struggling to keep itself cool. This thing is massive. It takes up a lot of room on the desk, and the placement of power and USB ports is pretty frustrating. If this thing had more options for ports, like a pluggable USB-C dock with a HDMI or SD cards and Ethernet, I think it would be a very interesting option and would definitely make this thing's price much more appealing. Though as it stands, I think it's quite hard to justify for most users, as it's not comfortable for day-to-day use because it puts your laptop several inches in the air. I think the best thing I can suggest is that you just try it out for yourself. Order one online, try it out with your laptop at different speeds and tests, and see if it makes a difference for your workflow. If it doesn't, then I guess you just return it if it's not useful for its intended purpose. Anyway guys, that brings us to the end of the video. What do you guys think? Could you see yourself making use of something like this in your sort of day-to-day workflow? If so, please let me know. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comment section down below. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like, and if my face hasn't offended you, don't forget to get subscribed. If you are interested in checking out this laptop cooler from Llano or any extras I may have mentioned, make sure you check the description for my affiliate links and those discount codes. I'll catch you in the next one, guys. Cheers.